In Rockville, Missouri, a house sold this year for $9,000. Not 900,000, 9,000. That is less than the average American pays for a used car. The house has walls, a roof, a foundation. It is, by any reasonable definition, livable. And it sold for that price anyway because almost nobody wanted it. In a village of 135 people that keeps getting smaller every year it's counted. I have spent a lot of time going through county courthouse records, old plat maps, and newspaper archives from this part of the country, and Rockville is not even the strangest story in Bates County. It's just the cheapest one. Before we get into how an entire stretch of Missouri emptied out, if you're new here, consider subscribing. This channel maps the parts of America that real estate listings don't advertise, and I'd genuinely like to know in the comments what state or country you're watching this from tonight. Now, West Central Missouri. Start with the fastest death first. Foster sits in the rolling farmland of southern Bates County, a few miles from the Kansas line, on a stretch of gravel road that most GPS systems still route drivers around rather than through. In 1884, this was empty pasture. There was no town here at all. Then the Walnut Land and Coal Company, backed by roughly $1 million of investment capital, decided there was coal underneath that pasture. And within a matter of months, Foster had 2,000 residents. Not over a decade. Not over a generation. Within months. Newspapers of the era described the town going up, in their own words, like a rocket, with saloons, stores, a depot, blacksmith shops, and a bank built essentially overnight to serve miners arriving faster than the town could plan for them. Then it came down just as fast. The coal seams underneath Foster proved shallower and less profitable than investors had hoped, and the railroad traffic the town depended on never fully materialized at the volume promised. Within a few years, the boom reversed itself entirely. Miners left for richer seams nearby, particularly around Rich Hill, a short distance north. The bank closed. The saloons closed. The population that had exploded to 2,000 almost as quickly deflated. Today, Foster is home to 76 people. The census still lists it as a village, and in the most literal sense, it is, since almost none of the original boomtown infrastructure survives. A handful of modest homes, most built long after the coal rush ended, sit along quiet streets originally platted for a city many times their current size. The catch here isn't danger or isolation, it's arithmetic. Foster was built for an economy that lasted only a few years. And once that economy left, there was never a second reason for 2,000 people to live there. No industry replaced coal. The land itself is fine, and the small community that remains is close-knit and functioning, but there simply is not enough economic activity within a reasonable drive to support the population the town was originally built for. Foster is a monument to how fast speculative capital can build a place, and how fast it can abandon one. What makes Foster worth opening on is how ordinary its ruin looks today. There is no dramatic skyline of collapsed buildings, no eerie row of boarded storefronts for cameras to linger on. The 2,000 people, and everything they briefly built, simply are not there anymore, and the land quietly returned to being farmland again, as though the boom had barely happened at all. That is, in many ways, the truest version of a ghost town. Not a place frozen in decay, but a place erased so completely that only the county records remember it was ever anything more than pasture. 900 miles of Missouri sits between the Ozark Hills and the Iowa border, and near the very top of the state, tucked against that Iowa line, sits the smallest county in Missouri by population, outside the independent city of St. Louis itself. Worth County was carved out of neighboring Gentry County in 1861, named for a general of the Mexican-American War, and its seat, Grant City, was laid out 3 years later along what eventually became U.S. Route 169. Worth County's story isn't one of a mine collapsing or a railroad bypassing a single town. It's slower and in some ways sadder. Around 1900, the county held nearly 10,000 residents, farming some of the flattest, richest cropland in the entire Midwest. But agriculture in the 20th century did something to counties like Worth that no single disaster ever could. Machines replaced hands. A farm that once required a dozen families to work now requires one family and several $100,000 of equipment. The people who used to work that land simply weren't needed on it anymore, and no factory, no second industry ever arrived to absorb them. By 2020, Worth County's population had fallen under 2,000, a decline of roughly 80% from its peak. Grant City itself, the county seat, now holds around 800 residents, a figure still falling by close to 1% a year according to recent estimates. The poverty rate in Grant City sits near 28%, more than double the statewide average. Walk the courthouse square in Grant City today, and you'll find a well-maintained 19th century courthouse, still functioning, still the center of county government, surrounded by storefronts that increasingly are not. The local school district survives, consolidated with neighboring communities to keep enrollment high enough to justify keeping the doors open at all. The catch in Worth County isn't a poisoned well or a flooded basement, it's distance and scale. The nearest larger job markets sit an hour or more away by car. Healthcare beyond basic services means a similar drive. And the county's population is spread too thin across its 267 square miles to support much beyond what farming families themselves need. Worth County is, quite literally, running out of people before it runs out of land. 90 miles south of Kansas City, Rich Hill announces its own history right on its town murals downtown, the town that Cole built. And it was, almost overnight. Before 1871, the site was empty prairie dotted with scattered farms. That year, a rich vein of coal was discovered nearby. The Rich Hill Coal Mining Company moved in, and the population, which had been close to zero, climbed to roughly 6,000 people by 1888, making it briefly one of the larger towns in western Missouri. The town's peak came with real tragedy attached. On March 29, 1888, a coal mine explosion killed 13 miners, all of them black men working the seams south of town, in an era when mining camps in this part of Missouri were more integrated in their workforce than much of the surrounding countryside. County cemetery records, rediscovered decades later by local historians, show all 13 were buried together, mourned by a crowd of roughly 300 people from the surrounding mining camps. By 1906, the easily accessible coal was largely gone. Deep mining became too expensive to remain profitable, and Rich Hill's population began the long slide that has continued, with one notable interruption ever since. Strip mining by Peabody Coal revived the local economy for a period in the 1950s, but by then, the town had already lost most of the scale it once had. Today, Rich Hill holds a little over 1,200 residents. It's one of the more stable and livable communities on this list, with a functioning grocery store, a school, and a well-regarded 4th of July celebration that draws visitors from well outside the county. Homes in Rich Hill have listed in recent years anywhere from under $60,000 for older properties needing work, up toward $300,000 for newer construction. A wide range reflecting a town still finding its footing between decline and modest revival. The catch here is milder than elsewhere on this list. Rich Hill's economy still depends heavily on agriculture and a limited number of local employers, and job growth beyond that has been essentially flat for decades. It is not a ghost town. It is a town that found a floor and has been standing on it carefully for over a century. There's something worth sitting with in how differently Rich Hill and Foster ended up, given how similarly they began. Both were built almost entirely on coal. Both boomed within a few short years of a discovery, and both eventually watched that coal run thin. But Rich Hill had enough scale and enough surrounding farmland to fall back on to survive as a real town even after the mines emptied out. Foster never reached that same critical mass. Sometimes the difference between a surviving small town and a near-vanished one comes down to nothing more dramatic than how big the boom happened to get in the first place. 4 miles across a small lake from Rockville sits a town most people outside Vernon County will never hear mentioned in their lives. Shell City was laid out in 1871 by a group of investors, including two brothers from New York, Augustus and Richard Shell, who never lived there themselves, but lent the town their name anyway. Within 9 years, the population had grown to nearly 700 residents, complete with its own local newspaper and enough retail business to make it a genuine commercial hub for the surrounding farmland. Then, 1885 happened. Over roughly 5 months, Shell City suffered 3 significant fires. The first 2 caused damage. The third, in early August, was described by a local newspaper correspondent as devastating, destroying several general stores and other downtown businesses within hours, in an era before the town had any organized fire department to respond. Wooden storefronts built close together, common to boom towns of the period, meant a single blaze could take out an entire commercial block before help could arrive from anywhere else. The town rebuilt, and by 1890, its population had actually climbed back to around 850, its historical peak. But the underlying economics of a small agricultural trade town in a region increasingly served by larger hubs and better roads worked against Shell City for the century that followed. The population drifted downward decade after decade, not because of any single catastrophic event after 1885, but because there was never again a strong enough reason for growth. Today, Shell City is home to fewer than 250 residents. The Shell Osage Conservation Area next door draws hunters and anglers through town seasonally, providing a small but real trickle of outside income that many similarly sized Missouri towns simply don't have. The catch in Shell City is one of simple scale. It never had a single industry big enough to anchor real growth, only agricultural trade. And trade towns tend to lose out first once transportation improves, and shoppers can drive 20 extra minutes to a bigger selection in Nevada or Butler. There's no contamination here, no unusual flood risk, just a town that was always a little too small to be essential to anyone beyond the people who already live there. If you're finding some of these stories as strange as I did researching them, that's exactly why I do this, and it's an easy way to support the channel if you haven't subscribed yet. Now, back to the towns, starting with the one we opened on tonight. Rockville was laid out in 1868, named for the white sandstone quarries that once operated nearby, supplying stone for buildings across the region. A post office opened here in 1871. And for a while, Rockville functioned as a modest but real commercial center for the surrounding farms, small but not unusual for its era. Quarrying never became a major regional industry the way coal did in Rich Hill or Foster, and Rockville's peak population, even at its height around the turn of the 20th century, likely never exceeded a few hundred residents. What's happened since then is less a collapse than a slow, steady erosion. The 2000 census recorded 162 residents. By 2020, that number had fallen to 135. Recent estimates put it lower still, essentially flat at a very low level rather than actively crashing. This is the town where, earlier this year, that house sold for $9,000. It's worth being precise about what that figure represents. It was not a mansion in disguise, and it was not a scam. Property records show a modest, older residential structure, likely needing significant work, in a town with very little competing demand for housing of any kind. When only a handful of buyers exist for a property in the entire regional market, prices settle wherever those few buyers are willing to go, and in a town of 135 people, that number can be very low indeed. The catch in Rockville is straightforward. There simply aren't enough jobs, services, or amenities within the town itself to make it self-sustaining. The nearest full-service grocery store, hospital, and most employers sit 20 to 30 minutes away by car in Butler or further out toward the edge of the Kansas City metro area. That's a livable arrangement for someone who already has remote work, a pension, or a job that doesn't require a daily commute. It's considerably less livable for a young family that needs school options, childcare, or two incomes within reasonable driving distance. Rockville is proof that in rural Missouri, price and livability are not the same question, and a $9,000 house only answers one of them. Not every town on this list is dying in a straight line, and Golden City is a useful reminder of that. Founded as a trading post in the mid-19th century, Golden City grew quickly once the railroad reached it in the 1880s, becoming for a time home to the first rail line in that part of Barton County. Its population peaked at just under 900 residents around 1920, a modest but genuine regional hub for the surrounding wheat and cattle farms of Missouri's tall grass prairie country. The decline that followed was gradual rather than sudden. There was no single mine closure or catastrophic fire here. Instead, the same forces reshaping farm towns across the entire Midwest, mechanized agriculture requiring fewer workers, small farms consolidating into larger operations, and young people migrating toward cities for education and jobs, chipped away at Golden City's population year after year, decade after decade. Today, Golden City holds a little over 650 residents, roughly a quarter smaller than its historical peak. Though notably, that decline has largely leveled off in recent years rather than continuing to accelerate. Median household income sits around $44,000, and the poverty rate hovers just under 19%, figures that place it among the more economically strained small towns in this part of the state without being the most extreme example on this list. The town still functions as a genuine, if modest, community center, with local businesses, a school, and a historical society actively working to preserve what remains of the original townsite architecture. The catch in Golden City is really about sealing rather than collapse. There's no acute danger driving people away, no poisoned water, no annual flood. What's missing is opportunity. Wages here run well below the state average, and the jobs that do exist skew heavily toward agriculture and its supporting businesses, meaning anyone who doesn't want to farm or work adjacent to farming has limited local options and often leaves for exactly that reason. Not every ghost story in western Missouri involves a mine or a flood. Sometimes it's simply a name that outlived the ambition behind it. Amsterdam, Missouri, was officially platted in 1891, named not for any local connection to the Netherlands, but because railroad executive Arthur Stilwell chose the name to flatter a Dutch financier, Jan de Goysen, whose company was based in the actual city of Amsterdam and whose money was helping fund Stillwell's railroad expansion through this part of the state. The town that resulted was, for its time, a reasonably functional small railroad stop, serving the farms of western Bates County with a depot, a post office established the following year, and enough local commerce to sustain a population that held at a modest but stable level for decades. Amsterdam never experienced a dramatic single-event collapse. Its population actually held up better than many neighboring towns through much of the 20th century, even posting a local peak of 287 residents as recently as 2003. But the broader pattern common to nearly every town on this list eventually caught up here too. Rail traffic that once justified small depot towns like this one declined steadily as trucking took over freight, farms consolidated, and needed fewer resident laborers. And the young people raised in Amsterdam increasingly left for Kansas City, less than 2 hours away, rather than staying to work the land or the few remaining local jobs. Today, Amsterdam is home to roughly 218 residents, and population data suggests that number has essentially plateaued rather than continuing a sharp decline, a pattern common among the very smallest towns that have already lost most of what they were ever going to lose. The catch in Amsterdam is proximity paired with irrelevance. It sits close enough to the Kansas City metro area to technically be counted as part of it by federal statistical definitions, yet far enough and small enough that almost none of that metro area's economic growth actually reaches it. It's a town caught in the gravitational field of a major city without receiving any of that city's benefits. Save the strangest story for last, and in western Missouri, that story belongs to a town that, as of a few years ago, technically stopped being a town at all. Corning sits in the far northwest corner of the state in Holt County, hard against the Missouri River and the smaller Big Tarkio Creek. Between the 1870s and 1900, Corning held somewhere between 300 and 350 residents, a legitimate farming and shipping community that, according to local accounts, once sent boxcars of apples out by rail toward Nebraska and beyond, alongside corn, cattle, hogs, and lumber. What Corning never had was a way to escape the river. The Missouri River, joined here by the Big Tarkio, has flooded this stretch of Holt County repeatedly across more than a century. And each flood took a bite out of the town that the next generation never fully replaced. The town lost its school in the 1950s. Its train depot came out not long after. Then came the historic flood of 1993, one of the most damaging in Missouri River history, followed by the usual population decline that follows these events, followed by the loss of the local post office, its zip code, and even its telephone exchange. If that sounds severe, what came next was worse. The 2011 Missouri River flood breached a levee near Corning, sending water through the community again and prompting officials to close 2 major river bridges in the state for the duration. In 2019, another major flood arrived, staying longer and sitting deeper than the one 8 years before it. By the early 2020s, so few residents remained that Holt County's own records showed the political subdivision of Corning had exactly 2 registered voters. In late 2022, county commissioners accepted a petition to officially unincorporate the village of Corning, ending its formal legal existence as a town. There's essentially no real estate market left to speak of in Corning today because there is, functionally, no town left to buy into. What remains are a small number of structures and a few families still living on higher ground nearby, and a floodplain that the Missouri River has made unmistakably clear it still considers its own. The catch in Corning isn't subtle, isn't buried in old records, and doesn't need a historian to explain it. It's the river itself, returning again and again, for over 100 years, until there was finally nothing left for it to take. So why do all of these places keep emptying out, decade after decade, town after town, across the same stretch of prairie? There's no single reason. Coal seams run out, railroads get rerouted, rivers reclaim their floodplains on their own schedule, not ours. Machines replace the hands that used to work the fields. But underneath all of it sits the same quiet math. These towns were mostly built for economies that no longer exist, sized for populations that industry no longer needs, and once that mismatch sets in, it rarely reverses on its own. Could you actually live in a place like Rockville or Corning or Foster? Some people clearly still do, and clearly love it. But it takes a specific kind of life to make it work. Remote income or retirement, or roots deep enough to outweigh convenience, and a genuine comfort with distance from hospitals, grocery stores, and almost everyone else you know. For most people, it isn't a place to escape to on a whim. A $9,000 house is real, and it is exactly the kind of number that gets a video like this made. But the honest verdict is that the house was never really the hard part. Anyone with modest savings can buy a cheap house in western Missouri. The hard part is building a life around it, a job, a doctor, a school, a reason to still be there in 20 years, in a place where the whole surrounding region has been quietly emptying out for a century. That's the part these towns can't sell you at any price. I'll leave you with this. If a $9,000 house came with an entire small town attached, population and all, would you actually take it? Tell me honestly in the comments. There are more forgotten corners of this country still waiting to be found. We'll go looking for the next one soon. This video is for informational and historical purposes only and is not financial or investment advice. Property values change, and viewers should do their own research or consult a professional before making any purchase decisions.